The best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Dr. Robin Pierucci is a board-certified neonatologist. Dr. Pierucci, welcome to the conversation.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
You meet parents typically at the start of a trauma or a crisis, and you walk with them in a very considered, compassionate way. So I thought one way we could have this conversation is to just talk about that process, and that'll naturally lead to some examples of people you've worked with. And give us a little flavor of that kind of that moment. A prenatal diagnosis, you've said, is not equivalent to a postnatal prognosis, but give us a little flavor, like what kind of diagnoses we're talking about here.
Well, it's a great question. One of the first things that happens is this prenatal testing, which what happens, at least for many women, is there's not very good informed consent. What exactly are you signing up for? I've heard women say, I don't know. I've had, obstetricians who admit, yeah, it's pretty much become a routine. And there's a real danger in that because people stop explaining well. And I don't want to paint with too broad a brushstroke in that the office is busy. But what happens is when it comes to getting some of these early genetic diagnoses, it's our obligation as physicians to first of all ask why. Why are we getting this test? And, the history of prenatal testing is pretty dark because a lot of times the reason it was being done was to offer termination if the baby wasn't, quote, perfect or normal. And it gets tied up with this bizarre notion of all suffering is bad. And certainly nobody wants the parents to suffer. Nobody wants the child to suffer. But it changes over into this ableist utilitarian viewpoint of if you're not perfect by whatever means that, we're judging that lately, somehow the baby's life isn't worth living. The first time that someone documented a prenatal test in the literature for specifically using genetic testing was the amniocentesis back in 1960. And there's literature that points out this was the first time that they documented this. It was done on two women who were carriers for hemophilia. Now, hemophilia, back in 1960, if they had had children that had this disease, they probably didn't have factor. I'm sure it was awful to watch. But the point is, they were doing it with the idea that if it was a boy, they would terminate that child. Wow. My heart just breaks. But that's, the beginning and the history of this.
Yeah, well, so if that's the kind of the context, it sounds like it sounds rather daunting trying to confront that. But on the other hand, I'm thinking of Mother Teresa. The criticism of her was that, you can't help these people, and obviously she helped an enormous amount of people. But her logic was, let's just take the person in front of me, let's take the diagnosis in front of me in this case, and offer help there. So take us, make it a little more concrete for me, if you could.
Well,
in terms of the kinds of diagnoses that you're seeing and the kind of errant information that's there, if you will.
Well, there's a whole range of diagnoses, whether it's a genetic diagnosis that can now be done as early as around 10 weeks with a test called NIPT. That's just a blood test from mom, which tells you about trisomy 21, which is Down syndrome, trisomy 18, trisomy 13, which, by the way, when I was in med school, I was told it was a lethal diagnosis, and we now know that's not true. They could be life-limiting, but what we've also learned is the more we intervene for these children, we're seeing a lot of them live quite a bit longer and of infinite value to their families. So to paint it as an automatic death sentence is just wrong. Now, the babies are not fine. There are significant medical needs usually. I would never hide that. but it doesn't make them less human. And that's where I enter in, is whether parents have a genetic diagnosis or there's something wrong on the anatomy scan, which usually happens around 20 weeks. Parents are often told, I mean, we sound like Eeyore, how we're trained in medical school. They're like, oh, I'm so sorry. And the person dutifully rattles off every single possible thing that could ever go wrong, whether or not it applies to this child, whether or not we know that's true or not. That's what's being told to people, and hope is destroyed.
It's really interesting to hear you describe that, because you're there as the parent. You're enthusiastic because it's your child. It's just that simple, whether
Right.
the diagnosis is bleak or not, bleak in quotes. But we are influenced by the way other people particularly people in authority, project information to us.
In addition to the trauma of just learning that things are not right, when you usually aren't expecting that for a lot of the time. Some parents are, but most of the time they're blindsided. And ACOG, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, now, and Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine, the high-risk obstetricians, their statement is basically, if there is something wrong because of the worshiping of choice in America, you must offer termination. So people are still stunned in the first crisis of, what do you mean there's something wrong? And you've now told me everything is bleak and terrible. And now you're offering me to be complicit in my own baby's death? What? There's just so many people that this is a traumatizing moment. And I say traumatizing very carefully, literally that these are the signs and symptoms that the American Psychiatric Association delineates as traumatic. This is a sudden event that changes everything. People report being numb, confused. You can't hear at that point. I mean, everything sounds like Charlie Brown's teacher talking at you. It is, parents describe this, as a, whether it's a plane crash, a car wreck, the train smacking into each other. You remember life before that moment and life after.
Talk to us about a diagnosis and kind of a walk, so to speak, with a couple facing a surprising diagnosis.
Well, the first thing I love to get to say is congratulations on your pregnancy. And have you chosen a name? Giving parents permission to name their child. I often get tears just because they're so grateful someone asked, because the baby has intrinsic value. And
that's a life-giving question, right? It opens up a whole new range of possibilities that might have been kind of shut down by that kind of, you have the option to kill this child logic.
Right. So this is permission to name your child if you haven't. And then I get to hear the story, because every story is unique. There can be general diagnoses or general findings that you see. And then here's in this unique person. So which is just basic being a doctor and taking good history of into what situation have you walked. But then it's a discussion about, with all humility, what do we really know and what do we not know? Specifically, people understand if you get a diagnosis of cancer. I've known people with that diagnosis who've lived for 3 days and others for 30 years. There's so
this is
much
your phrase.
Right.
Prenatal diagnosis is not a postnatal prognosis. Yeah.
Correct. From a diagnosis to, it gives us some ideas, but there's, once again, a little humility in front of how much we don't know. By the way, sometimes we get the diagnosis wrong. Other times we get the diagnosis right, but how specifically will that affect your baby? And, we don't, in any other patient population, we don't make broad statements like vote you off the island until you meet the patient. To do that prior to birth and us getting to see the baby and how is this manifested in them, it is just bizarre to me. Just in the practice of neonatology for all of, close to 25 years. Yeah, my partners, sometimes they got it right. Sometimes, nope, we sent babies home who had a, quote, lethal diagnosis. And now you push the envelope with, okay, how fine were they? And there's a range of babies who really were okay and others who went home with medical needs, but they were all of intrinsic value. And it was about how do I help parents be able to care well for their child, which is really what then, after I hear the story of what happens in the pregnancy so far, we continue to meet during the pregnancy and afterward, and it's all about mitigating the trauma of diagnosis day. How do we provide safety?
What would be an example of a traumatic diagnosis that you've faced with a couple?
Just yesterday, one of the trisomy 13s, and this particular baby has some cardiac issues, and the poor mom, met with, who is just one of the sweetest human beings on the planet, met with a cardiologist where it was just like, well, here's what we can do. Doesn't look good. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you have a medical team who they don't even believe things can be okay, I'm like, all right, let's talk again about this. And what I get to do is sometimes whisper in the ear of parents, here's some questions to ask, and helping them grow into becoming the advocate that their child needs. And I'm so proud of the parents.
What did you whisper into her ears in this particular case?
In this particular case, it's like we talked about what to expect, and tell me more about reminding them that our goal is evaluate and stabilize. And the reason for that is we want the baby to inform us what they do or don't need. So, okay, thank you for all the information prenatally. Are you on board to evaluate and stabilize this? If we get out of labor and delivery, because the baby can tell us. And by the way, in the background, I talk with parents about, here's what responding to treatment looks like. And then we go this way. Here's what not responding looks like. And then we go a different direction. But in no point in that sentence is there room for abandonment or not caring.
Yes. Right, the focus shifts back to where it belongs, is simply what the child needs. And kind of clinical insight combined with compassion to help the parents get on what I'll call with the job of caring for the child, rather than being as you described, kind of numbed by it, by the diagnosis. It
really is a goal of inviting the medical team onto the same page.
Great.
This is, and because the last thing I want is to show more dissent, in the ranks. It's an invitation, and that's why we write a birth plan together. And when they bring that, I've had an example of it absolutely won over the team. Our babies, they rescue us. They really do. And I have seen parents who are not on the same page initially falling in love with their child. I've seen medical teams. One doctor actually said, after initially refusing this, just saying there's nothing to be done here, came back and told this one mom, I wasn't thinking about this as a parent.
Just take us down the path, so to speak, with a child you've worked with a family you've worked with, and just tell us a little bit more about how it's played out over time.
If, there's getting through the pregnancy itself, and there are some babies who have a fetal demise, and we plan for that. But it doesn't mean hope is destroyed, because I love getting to remind parents, you have succeeded by surrounding your baby with love for every nanosecond of their life. That is a success. And by the way, your little one is a saint because they will never offend God, which I do by rolling out of bed. So these guys,
Well put.
this is a little saint. And if we get to the alive birth, once again, evaluate and stabilize is the goal. And the baby, if Alice responds, all right, that can be a NICU stay. Sometimes it just means the baby responds long enough to live for a brief time. I've had little ones with anencephaly, but I've also had parents say, this was the most sacred hour and 16 minutes of my life. I would never have missed this.
That was the Best of the Week on Relevant Radio. The best way to listen to the Best of the Week is on the Relevant Radio app. Free and always free. Download and share the #1 free Catholic app today in the App Store.